Life is unpredictable, but preparing for the unexpected shouldn't be. Take ownership of your life planning with Policy Genius to help your loved ones have a financial safety net in case something happens to you. They offer life insurance policies starting at just $276 a year for $1 million in coverage. Don't wait for life to make other plans. Protect your family today. Head to PolicyGenius.com. That's PolicyGenius.com.
I died in hell. They called it Passchendaele. Those were the words written by poet Siegfried Sassoon to describe a place that has gone down in history as one of the nastiest, the ugliest, the most brutal, the most horrifying battles in all of human history. Officially, it was called the Third Battle of Ypres, but the British called it Passchendaele. Today, I want to take some time to share a little bit of the background into that battle, share some of the stories from that battle, and just try to talk through and process what it was that made Passchendaele hell on earth. But first, a little bit of background. I have had the privilege over the last several months to make 2 trips to Belgium. And in not my most recent trip, but the one before that, I spent the better part of a week in the town of Ypres. Now, it's spelled Y-P-R-E-S. That is the French spelling. You have to remember that if you're not familiar with Belgium and its history and its makeup, Belgium can basically be divided in terms of language into 2 distinct parts. The western and northern part of the country is an area known as Flanders. And in Flanders, they speak a dialect of Dutch that we call Flemish. Now, having been in the Netherlands and having been in Flanders, I can tell you they don't sound anything alike to a native English speaker. It's, I guess, would be the difference to someone speaking a foreign language who heard someone from Scotland and someone from the United States both speaking English. You can see how that would be difficult, and it could sound like a completely different language. That's the case. So that is some of the reason why there are so many different ways that people pronounce the name of this town. You'll hear it Ypres or Ypres, or the British just called it Wipers because it was a lot easier and it was just kind of a phonetic spelling of it. But if you go there, the native people who live in that town who speak Flemish spell it I-E-P-E-R, and they pronounce it Ypres. And so that's what I have chosen to do. If you go to the eastern and southern parts of Belgium where they speak French, you're going to see a different spelling and a different pronunciation. Well, all the maps that the British Army had were in French, and so that was how it was spelled. Ypres is best remembered today as the town around which some of the worst fighting in all of human history took place. But its history goes back so much further. It goes back to ancient times. There was a town on that site that was raided by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. And in the intervening millennia, it has been fought over by the English, by the French, even by the Austrians. 800 years ago, Ypres had a population of about 40,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in all of Western Europe. It was even mentioned in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, the reason it was such a populous town and the reason it had so many connections to English authors like Geoffrey Chaucer who wrote about it is because Ypres has always been known for its cloth trade, which was centered in the 13th century cloth hall. This wonderfully constructed, beautiful, centuries-old building that was basically obliterated during the First World War. It remains one of Ypres' most prominent landmarks. And unfortunately, it was mostly destroyed, but it has since been rebuilt. And the reason why that matters is because cloth was a big part of the connection of this land to the British. The British had a lot of sheep, had a lot of wool that they were producing, and that could be exported for the cloth trade. And so there was a lot of trade connections between these two. So how is it that this town that really hadn't seen any significant growth in 700 years becomes notorious as one of the bloodiest and most awful places in the history of warfare? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is location. It's a strategic crossroads, much like Gettysburg was in the American Civil War, or Bastogne in the Second World War. From Ypres, the German army could march on the strategic coastal towns of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne. It was also one of the last major obstacles in the First World War to complete German control of the town of Belgium. What happens is when the Germans, I don't want to get into a long, drawn-out description of German strategy in the early stages of World War I, but basically the Germans were trying to get around French defenses, much like they do in World War II. And so they were marching through Belgium to get around the northern flank of the French. Well, there eventually became known as something that we have erroneously called the race to the sea. It really wasn't a race to the sea. It was just a series of attempts by the Allies and by the Germans to outflank one another further and further to the north until they ran out of room by running into the English Channel, the North Sea. And so Ypres becomes this stop on that race to the sea where the Germans get there first, but then it's just kind of a scouting ahead party, and then they pull out of the town, and then the British and Commonwealth forces arrive in the town, and they decide that they're going to build their defenses on the outskirts of this town. So there were obvious strategic reasons for both sides to want to occupy the town because of the road network, because of the access to the coastal ports. The Allies, who then build their defenses around the outside of the town, create this bulge, this salient in the line that could be attacked by the Germans from three sides, and that was done throughout the war. And the Germans also held high ground surrounding the salient, which made it easy for artillery observers to locate and fire on targets. And in a situation like that, it didn't take long for the casualties to mount. During the course of the war, there were at least 5 distinct battles that were fought in and around Ypres, and each of those major battles could actually be broken down. They're really more campaigns, and they could be broken down into multiple battles with names and identities of their own. Places that would become notorious during the war, like Polygon Wood, Sanctuary Wood, Hill 60, Passchendaele, Tyne Cot, Messine Ridge, Gellivelt, and more. The First Battle of Ypres was fought in October and November of 1914 and produced around 250,000 casualties. The Second Battle of Ypres saw the introduction of poison gas to the Western Front in the spring of 1915 and produced around 100,000 casualties. The Third Battle of Ypres, the one we'll be talking about today, was fought in the summer and fall of 1917 and produced as many as 800,000 casualties. The Fourth Battle of Ypres, known as the Battle of the Lys, was fought in April 1918 as part of the German Kaiserschlacht offensive, and it produced around 200,000 casualties. And the last battle, sometimes known as the Fifth Battle of Ypres, was fought in the fall of 1918 with around 10,000 Allied and an unknown number of German casualties. And of course, in between these specific battles, there was skirmishing, artillery duels, sniper fire, and there was death from disease. Needless to say, Ypres earned its place in history as one of the deadliest places on earth, especially for British and Commonwealth and German forces. There's a reason why Winston Churchill would go on to say of Ypres, quote, "A more sacred place for the British race does not exist in the world," end quote. So by the time we get to 1917, the Ypres salient has already produced well over 1 million casualties. It's already hell on earth. 3 years of trench warfare have devastated the surrounding countryside. Whole villages in no man's land have simply ceased to exist. The Germans continued to hold the high ground surrounding the British positions in the salient with clear views for their artillery observers. The lines have changed very little in the 2+ years of warfare that have taken place on this site. And one of the things I should probably mention about the landscape in the Ypres salient is you have to understand that in this area, the water table is extremely high and the land is extremely low in relation to sea level. It's basically in many places below sea level. And so you don't have to dig down very far in the ground in order to reach groundwater. And it also rains, and it rains a lot in this part of Europe. And so all of that creates a situation in which the standard trench warfare that exists in other parts of the Western Front looks differently here, because most of this land is reclaimed marshland. 3 years of war has destroyed the system of drainage ditches that have made the land habitable, made it dry enough to farm. And the whole salient is turning into a swamp. The soil just isn't conducive to the trenches that are built elsewhere along the Western Front. And so the Germans have instead dotted the landscape with a series of strong points, these really thick, reinforced pillboxes. And you can still see them to this day, 100 years later, in places like the Tynkot Cemetery, which was one of the strong points. Now, as for the Allies, they were not in a good place by the summer of 1917. The French are wavering after mutinies in their ranks, and the Russians are dealing with revolutions at home. And so it's up to the British, under Commander Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, to take the pressure off the Russians and the French. He wins a stunning victory at Messines Ridge, and that kind of becomes the catalyst for what we're going to see next, because it happens so successfully and it happens so quickly at Messines Ridge on the southern part of the salient that there's a degree of overconfidence that sets in with the British, and they now believe that this is the moment where they can finally push the Germans off of Passchendaele Ridge in the northeast of the salient. The preliminary British bombardment in what became known as the Third Battle of Ypres began on the 16th of July with around 3,000 heavy guns, which rained shells along the entire German line surrounding the salient for the next 2 weeks. The advance began on July 31st. It was brutal from the beginning. Men's boots got stuck in the dirt as they struggled over the soft, cratered ground. It was slow, and it was exhausting, with many of the men carrying up to 80 pounds of equipment. Now, despite all of this, the initial attack did see some success. The men cleared the trenches and dugouts and captured a number of German prisoners. British command judged from the first reports that a breakthrough might be imminent and that the capture of Passchendaele Ridge itself was possible. But the problem was that all they had really taken so far were a few forward positions and machine gun outposts. The Germans by this point had abandoned their traditional system of trench lines and instead focused on what was known as a defense-in-depth system that went on for miles. And so as the British soldiers pushed forward, they suddenly found themselves under well-directed fire from camouflaged strong points, hidden pillboxes, and from snipers. They had, in fact, just entered the real kill zone. The first waves were mowed down or soon found themselves isolated from the rest of their units. Then, as the days went on, it began to rain. The steady downpour soaked the entire salient. Every man and gun was soon drenched, and the ground softened into an ugly quagmire of mud and clay. On the battlefield, all sense of direction was immediately lost. The terrain had changed so much that old maps, and even the more recent ones, became useless. Corporal Joseph Pincombe of the Queen's Westminster Rifles wrote this. He said, quote, "It was an extraordinary panorama, half frightening, half exciting. Everywhere, as far as you could see, there were spurts of earth from shells bursting and bursts of shrapnel and high explosives and men looking like ants in the distance. You couldn't speak, the gunfire was so terrific. But you don't really hear the explosions individually. You just see them going off like geysers shooting up in the air. As far as you could see in front of you and to either side, there was nothing but mud, mud, mud for miles, and then just a few stumps of trees here and there, and all hell let loose around you. You see, the very thing that made this attack possible, the heavy British bombardment that was meant to obliterate the frontline defenses, also destroyed anything that was left of the drainage systems. And so when the rain came, there was nothing to keep it from turning the ground into a just morass that was almost impossible to pass through. The stretcher bearers had it especially hard. Each step was exhausting. It would take 4 to 6 men to carry one stretcher, and even small distances could take hours. At night, the time when most wounded men would have normally been evacuated, it was impossible. The risk was simply too high from getting lost or stuck in the mud. Many of the wounded then simply died waiting for someone to come. Now, the Germans shared in the British misery in this ground, and it was reported that there was an unspoken rule not to fire on the stretcher parties. Lieutenant James Annan of the Royal Scots described it this way. He said, "Then there was a lull in the shelling, and through the machine gun slit on the back wall of the pillbox, we heard this terrible kind of gurgling noise. It was the wounded, lying there sinking in this liquid mud, burying them alive, running over their faces into their mouth and nose. We had to keep heaving the duck boards up and trying to put some other stuff underneath just so that the fellows wouldn't sink so much. We couldn't understand why, in the name of God, anyone had ordered an attack like that over terrain like that. It was impossible." Historian Adam Hochschild described it this way, quote, "Observation aircraft could not take to the sky, weapons jammed, and the clay soil of the watery moonscape of craters became sticky. Guns could barely be moved, and mules and horses pulling ammunition wagons sank up to their stomachs and had to be dug out. Ambulances carrying wounded soldiers skidded off slippery roads. A British soldier's greatcoat is not waterproof. It absorbed mud and water like a relentless sponge, adding 34 pounds to its weight. As the battle continued, a single day saw 26,000 casualties. One officer wrote, "The mud is not so much mud as a fathomless, sticky morass. The shell holes where they don't actually merge into one another are divided by only a few inches of this glutinous mud. The gunners work thigh deep in water. The men had to leave the safety of their trenches as the water rose above their waists in many places. Artillery would sink deeper into the mud with every shell they fired. Engineers tried to bridge flooded shell holes with pontoons and with these wooden walkways known as duckboards. In fact, if you look at photos that are taken during the Battle for Passchendaele, you'll see very prominently those duckboards that became really the only place where a man could pass. There was a constant fear of falling off and drowning in the mud, which often operated like quicksand. Many soldiers suffered the horrible death of sinking into the mud, his friends unable to pull him out and having to leave him behind. Tens of thousands of men were just never recovered from the battlefield." A private in the Royal Fusiliers remembered it this way. He said, quote, "In a way it was worse when the mud didn't suck you down. When it yielded under your feet, you knew that it was a body you were treading on. It was terrifying. You'd tread on the stomach, perhaps, and it would grunt all the air out of its body. It made your hair stand on end. The smell could make you vomit. And you could always tell whether it was a dead Jerry, a German, or a dead Tommy, meaning a British soldier. The Germans smelt different in death. Now, we could spend multiple episodes, probably an entire series of episodes, just talking about stories from this battle at Passchendaele. Had the opportunity to visit the Passchendaele battlefield in the village of Passchendaele, which is where the name comes from. As with all things, the British like to kind of butcher the names a little bit, but we remember it as Passchendaele. The village was basically obliterated. I encourage you, since I can't show it to you visually on a podcast, I would encourage you to look at the before and after aerial shots of Passchendaele Ridge, taken just a few weeks apart in the fall of 1917, and see what artillery did to that place. It's unbelievable to look at. So instead, what I want to do is I want to talk about the final push that resulted in the capture of Passchendaele Ridge, and I want to talk specifically about some of the acts of heroism that took place in those final weeks. The final push that resulted in the capture of Passchendaele Ridge was made over a 2-week period in late October and early November 1917 by a force made up of Canadian, British, Australian, French, and Belgian divisions. By October 30th, the Canadian Corps had relieved the exhausted 2nd Anzac Corps. Anzac, if you're not familiar, stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. These are the Australian and New Zealand troops. So whenever you hear Anzac, that's what they're referring to. And I'll be honest with you, I'm by no means an expert on the First World War, but in what I've studied of the Western Front, you take all of the nations who fought there, whether it's the British, the French, the Americans. There were Russian troops on the Western Front. You've got troops from South Africa and troops from Algeria and Morocco and New Zealand and Australia and Canada and Newfoundland, all these places. I don't know if there are better troops anywhere in the world in 1916 and 1917 than the Canadians. What they accomplished and the price they paid to accomplish it is really just beyond any words of mine that could do it justice. The assault on the village of Passchendaele itself came from a place called Crest Farm, which today contains the Canadian Memorial at Passchendaele. It's a small little park from which you can stand and look 700 yards up the hill, up the ridge, to a church that sits in the middle of the Passchendaele village. And there's a sign there indicating that last 700 yards, which is a little bit less than half a mile, took 10 days to be overcome by the Canadian battalions which attacked there. Before the final assault, General Currie predicted that it would cost the 4 Canadian divisions involved in the fight around 16,000 casualties to take Passchendaele Ridge. The final total was 15,654, including 4,000 dead. There were 9 Canadian soldiers who received the Victoria Cross for their actions in the last weeks of the battle for Passchendaele. I want to share their stories with you now. Tommy Holmes was a private with the 4th Battalion Canadian Mounted Rifles, a unit he had been with since February of 1917. He had fought at Vimy Ridge in April, and he had been wounded and temporarily sent back to England, where he was able to meet up with his brother Roy, who had enlisted earlier and had lost an eye with the 58th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. On October 26, 1917, near the ridge at Passchendaele, the Canadian forces launched the initial assault, and it was there that Tommy performed a deed for which King George V would award him the Victoria Cross. His citation says, quote, "When the right flank of the Canadian attack was held up by heavy machine gun fire from a pillbox strong point, and heavy casualties were producing a critical situation, Private Holmes, on his own initiative and single-handed, ran forward and threw 2 bombs, killing and wounding the crews of both machine guns. He then fetched another bomb and threw this into the entrance of the pillbox, causing the 19 occupants inside to surrender. It was only during his investiture at Buckingham Palace, when he received the Victoria Cross, that Holmes admitted to the king that he had actually lied about his age and joined the army at the age of 17. Tommy became the youngest recipient of the Victoria Cross in Canadian history. Christopher Patrick John O'Kelly was a 21-year-old acting captain in the 52nd Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces on that same day, October 26, 1917. And he led his company in action that resulted in his Victoria Cross. His citation reads as follows: "For most conspicuous bravery in an action in which he led his company with extraordinary skill and determination. After the original attack had failed, and 2 companies of his unit had launched a new attack, Captain O'Kelly advanced his command over 1,000 yards under heavy fire without any artillery barrage, took the enemy positions on the crest of the hill by storm, and then personally organized and led a series of attacks against pillboxes, his company alone capturing 6 of them with 100 prisoners and 10 machine guns. Later on in the afternoon, under the leadership of this gallant officer, his company repelled a strong counterattack, taking more prisoners, and subsequently during the night captured a hostile raiding party consisting of 1 officer, 10 men, and a machine gun. The whole of these achievements were chiefly due to the magnificent courage, daring, and ability of Captain O'Kelly." Captain O'Kelly eventually rose to the rank of major and became a prospector after the war in northwestern Ontario, where he unfortunately drowned in 1922 at the age of 26 while canoeing. His Victoria Cross is today displayed at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. George Mullen was born in Portland, Oregon, in the United States in 1891, but his parents moved to Saskatchewan when he was 2 years old. He enlisted in the Canadian Army in December of 1914. By 1917, he was 26 years old, and he was a sergeant in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, often known as the Princess Pats. On October 30th, 1917, at the Battle of Passchendaele, Sergeant Mullen would receive the Victoria Cross. His citation reads, "For most conspicuous bravery in an attack, when single-handed he captured a commanding pillbox, which had withstood the heavy bombardment and was causing heavy casualties to our forces and holding up the attack. He rushed a sniper's post in front, destroyed the garrison with bombs, and crawling on top of the pillbox, he shot the 2 machine gunners with his revolver. Sergeant Mullen then rushed to another entrance and compelled the garrison of 10 to surrender. His gallantry and fearlessness were witnessed by many, and although rapid fire was directed upon him and his clothes were riddled by bullets, he never faltered in his purpose, and he not only helped to save the situation, but also saved many lives." Another member of the Princess Pats was Hugh Mackenzie. Mackenzie had been born in Liverpool in the United Kingdom in 1885, but a few years before the outbreak of the Great War had emigrated to Canada. He enlisted in August of 1914 as a private, but he rose steadily through the ranks. As a corporal in 1916, he had received a Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions in command of a machine gun section. He was given a commission as a second lieutenant in 1917 and transferred to the Canadian Machine Gun Corps attached to the 7th Brigade Machine Gun Company. He was a 31-year-old lieutenant when he earned his Victoria Cross at Passchendaele on October 30th. Lieutenant Mackenzie was, quote, "in charge of a section of 4 machine guns, accompanying the infantry in an attack. Seeing that all the officers and most of the NCOs of an infantry company had become casualties, and that the men were hesitating before a nest of enemy machine guns, he handed over his command to an NCO, rallied the infantry, organized an attack, and captured the strong point. As machine gun fire from a pillbox nearby inflicted further casualties on the advancing Canadians, Mackenzie conducted a brief reconnaissance of the position, and after placing down troops in fire support positions, he led a frontal attack on the pillbox. The pillbox was subsequently captured, but Mackenzie was killed in the effort. In addition to his Victoria Cross, he also received the French Croix de Guerre for his actions, and he, like many of his comrades, has no known grave. And so his is one of the nearly 55,000 names inscribed on the Menin Gate Memorial in the town of Ypres. George Randolph Perks was born in Watford, England, in 1883. He went to Canada in 1906 and joined the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. In 1915, he enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, eventually rising to command of the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. His Victoria Cross was earned for actions on the 30th and 31st of October 1917, and his commendation reads as follows: "For most conspicuous bravery and skillful handling of the troops under his command during the capture and consolidation of considerably more than the objectives allotted to him in an attack. Just prior to the advance, Major Perks was wounded in the left thigh. Regardless of his wound, he continued to lead his men with the utmost gallantry despite many obstacles. At a particular stage of the attack, his further advance was threatened by a strong point, which was an objective of the battalion on his left, but which they had not succeeded in capturing. Quickly appreciating the situation, he captured and held this point, thus enabling his further advance to be successfully pushed forward. It was entirely due to his determination and fearless personality that he was able to maintain his objective with the small number of men at his command against repeated enemy counterattacks, both his flanks being unprotected for a considerable depth meanwhile. His appreciation of the situation throughout and the reports rendered by him were invaluable to his commanding officer in making dispositions of troops to hold the position captured. He showed throughout a supreme contempt of danger and wonderful powers of control and leading." Perks not only survived the war, but survived a Second World War. He served as a brigadier general in command of a Canadian infantry brigade during the Second World War, and was eventually made responsible for Canada's West Coast defenses. He rose to the rank of Major General, eventually served in the Canadian Parliament for 15 years, and served as Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia until 1968. George Perks lived until the age of 96. He died in 1984 and was buried with full military honors. Private James Peter Robertson was a part of the 27th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, which made the final assault on Passchendaele Ridge. Robertson was 6'3" tall, and he was known as Singing Pete. He was popular and a highly regarded soldier who had refused repeated offers of promotion. He was a man who was known to be willing to take risks, and on the 6th of November 1917, he was a part of the 27th Battalion's advance on Passchendaele. They followed a creeping barrage as they advanced, but as they drew nearer to the village, the opposition grew fiercer. One machine gun in particular was proving difficult to overcome. It was blocking the way into the main street and was heavily defended. 3 times a platoon charged, only to be driven back, when Robertson decided he needed to do something. While his comrades were firing their Lewis guns and rifles at the machine gun post, Robertson leapt up and sprinted alone across the line of fire, dashing around the flank. He hurdled the barbed wire fence and set about the gun team with his bayonet. Within seconds, 4 men were dead, and the remainder had fled, and Robertson turned their gun on them. This allowed the Canadians to advance into Passchendaele village with James Peter Robertson at the front of the advance, setting up his captured weapon and using it to great effect on the Germans. It took about 30 minutes to clear the village of Passchendaele and another hour the eastern crest of the ridge beyond the village. The rest of the day was spent consolidating their position, but there were some minor firefights that continued throughout the day. When Robertson saw 2 snipers from his battalion lying wounded ahead of the Canadian line, he went out to bring them in. He rescued one, but the enemy were closing in, making it more dangerous. He ignored the risks and went out again. Captain Theodore Roberts wrote about what happened next. He said, quote, "He fell before reaching the second man. He was probably hit, but picking himself up, he continued on his way and secured his second comrade. Slipping on the sticky mud, nearly exhausted, he stuck to his man and had put him down close to our line when an unlucky shell exploded nearby, killing him instantly." I had the privilege, among many others, to visit the grave of Private Robertson and leave not only a flag but also his picture at his grave in the Tyne-Cot Cemetery. He was one of the last of over 500,000 men to fall at Passchendaele. Colin Barron was born in 1893 in Scotland, but emigrated to Canada in 1910, and he enlisted in the CEF in 1914. He was a corporal in the 3rd Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces on November 6, 1917, when his unit was held up by 3 machine guns. Corporal Barron opened fire on them at point-blank range, rushed the guns, killed 4 of the crew, and captured the remainder. He then turned one of the captured guns on the retreating enemy, causing severe casualties. This action, like that of James Robertson, allowed the final advance on Passchendaele to continue. Barron survived the war, eventually rising to the rank of Sergeant Major, and during the Second World War, he served with the Royal Regiment of Canada. Like several of the others we've already talked about, Cecil Kinross was born in England, but emigrated to Canada with his family in 1912. He was a volunteer in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, enlisting as a private in the 49th Battalion. On October 30th, 1917, at Passchendaele, he received the Victoria Cross for most conspicuous bravery in action during the prolonged and severe operations at Passchendaele. Shortly after the attack was launched, the company to which he belonged came under intense artillery fire, and further advance was held up by severe fire from an enemy machine gun. You'll notice, if you haven't already, that there is a common theme to these 9 Canadian Victoria Crosses. They very often involve entire units being pinned down by machine gun fire and one man being brave enough to risk his life to take out those machine guns so that their men can continue. Private Kinross, making a careful survey of the situation, deliberately divested himself of all equipment save his rifle and bandolier, and regardless of his personal safety, advanced alone over the open ground in broad daylight, charged the enemy machine gun, killing the crew of 6, and seized and destroyed the gun. His superb example and courage instilled the greatest confidence in his company and enabled a further advance of 300 yards to be made and a highly important position to be established. Robert Shankland was born in 1887 in Scotland. He was the son of a railroad guard, and his first job was a clerk in the station master's office. He had moved to Canada in 1910, where he worked as a cashier at a creamery company in Winnipeg. When the First World War broke out, he enlisted in the 43rd Battalion, the Cameron Highlanders of Canada, as a private. By 1916, he had risen to the rank of sergeant and was in charge of a stretcher-bearer party when he received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions at Sanctuary Wood on the Ypres salient. He was later to be given a battlefield commission and continued to serve with the 43rd Battalion as an officer. On the morning of October 26th, he led a platoon of 40 men from D Company to the crest of the hill at Bellevue Spur, which was the main trench line defending the approach to Passchendaele. They overran that position, and they held that position, which was critical to capturing the town. On the right, the 58th Battalion, which was under heavy fire from a place called Snipe Hill, was forced to fall back after they failed to reach their objective. Some of the men from that battalion found their way to Shanklin's platoon, but this still left his right flank open. For 4 hours, they withstood incessant artillery shelling and German counterattacks and sustained a frightful number of casualties. By this time, the 8th Brigade on the left was forced to withdraw, and that left both of Shanklin's flanks exposed. His platoon was in danger of being cut off and losing this vital position that they had gained at a terrible cost. The only solution was to bring up reinforcements and launch a counterattack. Shanklin turned over his command to another officer and then weaved his way through the heavy mud and German shelling to battalion headquarters, where he gave a first-hand report of the situation. He also offered a detailed plan of how a counterattack with reinforcements could best be successful. He then made his way back to his men and led the attack, supported by reinforcements from 2 other battalions. For his actions that day, Robert Shanklin was awarded the Victoria Cross. An interesting side note, Robert Shanklin lived on Pine Street in Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada. There were 2 other Victoria Cross recipients who lived on that same street in that same town, Frederick William Hall and Leo Clark. It's believed to be the only street in the world to have 3 Victoria Cross recipients live on it. The city later would rename the street Valor Road in their honor. There's something remarkable to me in the stories of these 9 men who were awarded the Victoria Cross for actions in these last few weeks of the assault on Passchendaele Ridge. Maybe it's because many of them were pioneers. These were men who were born in Scotland or America or England and had come to Canada and embraced this new land as their own. There's some spirit that I guess is inherent to people who are willing to travel to a new place and settle it like that, that I think is indicative of many of these Canadians. And as I said early on, Canada, pound for pound, probably had the best soldiers in the war. I mean, these stories are repeated over and over and over again throughout the war. And it's just remarkable to read them. And as I often say, I don't believe that these men suddenly became heroes that day. This is who they already were. I think when you're under pressure like that, you find out who you really are. Some men crack. Some men can't handle it. And I'm not here to pass judgment on those men. That's probably what I would do. And that's the very natural human response to the incredible horrors and stress that these men were under for months on end. The mud, the artillery fire, the machine guns, the death, the destruction, the smells, the sights, things you would never be able to get out of your mind. But some men, under those same conditions, they rise up and they do what needs to be done. Not to get a medal, but to save the guy in the trench next to him, to make sure that he can go on living. And it's remarkable to me that as many of these men survived as did. You would think that in a battle like Passchendaele, where there were these massive casualties, that very few would have survived these acts of heroism, but many of them did. And living into the 1960s, 70s, even the 80s, it's remarkable. And so if you're Canadian and you're listening, be proud. Be proud of these incredible men who represented your nation so well. And we're going to tell a lot more stories like this from the Great War, because I think these are stories that need to be told. Thanks for joining me on the journey.